Oh, hi, my name is Ilan Goldenberg. I run the Middle East program here at CNAS. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today as we roll out our new report on what we would propose to be a new U.S. policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think we'll have a great discussion for the next hour or so. Just to start with some logistics, this discussion is on the record. And what we're going to do is have some of our panelists speak, and then after that, we will open it up for questions. You have the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. You can ask your questions there, and we'll sort of sift through that when we get to it. I'm not going to go through long introductions of our colleagues, but just to say we have three folks with us. The report was actually written by myself, my colleague Michael Koplow, who is the policy director at Israel Policy Forum, as well as Tamara Cofman Wittes, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we'll also have, the report has been based on a period of consultation and both meetings with Israelis, Palestinians, folks from the West Bank and Gaza, various international players, as well as a series of discussions in Washington with a sort of task force and study group. So we also have Shibley Telhami with us, who is one of the folks who participated in some of these sessions, because I think it's just important to reflect the different views, although very important to point out that the report is just the views of the authors themselves. I also just want to take a moment to thank our colleague Hattie Ammer, who is a senior adjunct senior fellow here at CNAS, but has been on a leave of absence for the past couple months, and is therefore was a partner for a long time on this project. And but since he is not here right now, is not did not finish a project with us as an author, but is here with us in spirit. I know. So with that, I think what I'll do is first turn it over for the three of us to start with presenting some of the ideas and what it is we think we should be doing. So maybe I'll on this issue. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Ilan. So I think the first thing to do here is to really set the context and frame what's going on that really gave rise for these recommendations. So for starters, what we see today is a different level of importance of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a regional and a global context. The sense that this is really at the center of the Middle East is no longer the case, and in some ways we seem to have something of an equilibrium at the moment, where there are changes on the ground, but there have not been any enormous flare-ups. In addition, we have seen over the past decade real Israeli territorial expansion into the West Bank. There are now about 650,000 Israelis who are living beyond the 1967 borders. Of course, there was the push for West Bank annexation that really picked up speed over the spring and summer before the Abraham Accords and the deal between Israel and the UAE. And we also see serious political volatility inside of Israel that makes it harder to resolve this dispute. There were 3 elections in the span of 11 months. I think anybody here who's following closely anticipates that 1 week from today, the Knesset is going to officially dissolve and go to a 4th election. And that makes any real political progress in resolving this conflict difficult as well. On the Palestinian side, there is the continuing uncertainty over governance, over President Abbas, over his control over Palestinian politics. There have just in recent weeks, we've seen the death of Saeb Erekat, we've seen the resignation of Hanan Ashrawi from the Central Committee. So within Palestinian governance, we really see kind of a logjam, and there is the continuing split between Fatah and Hamas, which also makes any progress difficult when you don't have Palestinian unity. There are the vast political and economic disparities between Israelis and Palestinians, particularly in Gaza. The GDP in the West Bank is about 10% of what it is inside of Israel. It's 5% in Gaza of what it is inside of Israel per capita. So this also, this difference creates a big hurdle as well. And we have hardening views on both sides regarding two states. At this point, if you look at Khalil Shakaki's polling, support for two states on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides are at about the lowest they have been since the Oslo Accords. So that's the basic context in which this report is coming. And then there are also questions about US policy and what it has been. The US role has shifted. While addressing the conflict certainly remains in the interest of the United States. As I mentioned before, it's less resonant and has a lower priority than it has in the past. There's also the fact that the Trump administration policies have in many ways undercut the traditional US role as a mediator between the two sides. The US is now viewed really as being tilted far more to the Israelis than it has been in the past. And some Trump administration policies very obviously made it harder to solve the conflict. While on balance, I think we support recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. There's no question that the way that decision was made and announced made it more difficult to engage with the Palestinians, and the Trump administration policies with regard to the West Bank and Gaza also made it even more difficult for the Palestinians to engage. But it's also the case that this is not simply on the Trump administration. The US has been at this for a long time unsuccessfully. There were unsuccessful negotiations, famously under President Clinton at Camp David, under President Bush at Annapolis, the 2013-14 process under President Obama. None of these succeeded in creating a peace deal. And so going back to the same old policies and the same old assumptions is unlikely to work. And finally, we do have domestic politics on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict changing. We've seen that in Congress, I think, on both sides of the aisle in the past few years, where you have both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party pockets of support for something that is not two states. And you have folks on the Republican side who have supported annexation. You have folks on the Democratic side who are calling for more drastic changes in policy toward Israel. And so the US role is changing as well. And what this means is that while the conflict is not ripe for resolution, it's not ripe for a final status agreement, it can't be ignored. The US obviously still has very strong interests in resolving it. Certainly the US does not want to see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict return to a time of violence and bloodshed that produces instability, much like we saw during the Second Intifada, for instance. And perhaps even more importantly, the conflict causes daily harm to the people who have to live with it. It causes daily harm to Israelis and Palestinians on the ground, and it risks the security of Israel and Palestinians neighbors, Israelis and Palestinians neighbors as well. And so the US has focused on this notion of getting to a final status agreement, but in doing so, it really has downplayed a lot of the daily pain of the conflict itself and the ways in which this conflict does not work for Israelis and Palestinians the longer it goes on. And so what we are proposing is a new US approach. And the real central idea here is that the US should abandon the traditional high-profile final status initiatives in which the US is the central mediator. And instead, it should focus on tangible steps on the ground to improve freedom, prosperity, and security of all the people living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And also make sure that we set conditions and preserve conditions for a future two-state agreement. And what that means is really three central lines of effort. The first is to tackle pressing issues that threaten any possibility of progress in addressing the conflict and preventing the US from playing a constructive role. The second is pursuing medium-term steps to meaningfully improve freedom, security, and prosperity for Israelis and Palestinians, and to advance and preserve the prospects of a negotiated two-state solution to the conflict. And finally, third, to reshape the US role by ending the US monopoly on peacemaking, resetting the way in which the United States government engages and structures the way it thinks about this conflict, and developing a process to make policy more sustainable over the long term, which includes, while still supporting a two-state outcome, starting to examine ways in which U.S. interests may be impacted if that isn't the eventual resolution. So those are the central lines that we're proposing. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Ilan to talk about some of the specifics of the policies in these buckets.
Thanks, Michael. So I'm going to talk about sort of the first two out of the first three buckets, right? The first bucket being the immediate steps that the U.S. should take, I'd say in the next year, hopefully, to reshape its role in the conflict and kind of, build some credibility and just address immediate emergencies. So those steps, I think, start with just rebuilding the constructive U.S. role by clarifying that the U.S. supports a negotiated two-state solution, which is something that's been in question for the past 4 years. And also clarifying that the basis of that two-state solution, at least the one that the U.S. supports, goes back to some of the traditional parameters and views that have long existed, both in international UN Security Council resolutions and previous American policy statements. Things like understanding that they're going to need to be there's going to need to be a capital for Israel and a capital for Palestine in Jerusalem. Understanding that, any territorial deal is ultimately going to have to be based on the 67 lines with mutually agreed swaps, just and agreed solutions for the refugees, and security arrangements that work for all, including a demilitarized Palestinian state. This is not because the U.S. needs to start pursuing all these things immediately. We're very clear that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about jumping into final status, but it's important to reset this also to make clear that, some of the proposals that the Trump administration has put forward in recent years and have really shifted the balance on this just are not workable and are not going to be the positions the U.S. should support. Second is rebuilding the relationship with the Palestinians. There hasn't been serious engagement between the Palestinian government and the United States government since 2017, when the U.S. announced that it was moving the capital to, the embassy to Jerusalem. And so there, I think some things can be done relatively quickly, restarting American assistance, especially restarting American assistance to UNRWA, which is the UN refugee agency that deals with the Palestinians. And then also rebuilding, the diplomatic relations by reopening the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem that was shut down by the Trump administration, ideally putting it in East Jerusalem, and having it engage directly with Palestinian people and the Palestinian leadership and have a direct tie back to Washington as it has historically had, and signaling in that we're trying to move towards Palestinian statehood in the long run, as opposed to, going through the U.S. embassy. That'll take more time. It will be more complicated for a number of different logistical sort of reasons. And also reopening the PLO mission in Washington, which has been shut down for the past 3 years, again, as part of the spirit of rebuilding relations with the Palestinians. That's going to be quite complicated. It relates to 3 separate pieces of U.S. legislation having to do with the classification of the PLO as a terrorist organization, according to the U.S. Congress, from a 1987 law, even though in reality, American officials meet with members of the PLO all the time. It's a bit of an outdated law. Also, 2 other laws, the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act and the Taylor Force Act, which create challenges in this space. But the reality is a lot of those things can't change in the US congressionally unless as part of this, you also have Palestinian leadership reforming the system of payments that are made to Palestinian prisoners and their families who are in Israeli jails, or and that has a lot to do. That's a complicated issue. These people are Palestinian society. These are an important constituency, but for Israelis, it's seen very negatively. And more importantly, like however you feel about it, and Shibley has actually written recently a great piece that explains this issue from the Palestinian perspective that I'm sure he'll get into. But just we're thinking pragmatically about a U.S.-Palestinian relationship. Like there's no way to rebuild it without reform here. And you have seen, some movement recently, at least news that the PA is seriously considering this, but you're going to have to change the system to be one that's based entirely on need, right? That is based entirely on people receive payments for welfare, social welfare, as they would in the United States, Europe, and other places, not based on anything else. Other sort of immediate issues that we point to, one is a big surge in Gaza and humanitarian assistance, working on electricity, water. We wrote a report at CNAS 2 years ago that went much deeper on this, but it's one that Gaza is one the US doesn't focus enough on. We always get distracted by the West Bank, but there are 2 million people living in Gaza in very difficult conditions. There's steps that can be taken immediately to help them. And then also, I think the very difficult challenge of settlements, which Michael mentioned. And here, we recommend a few things. One is, for a long time, the American position was that settlements are inconsistent with international law. That was recently changed. The State Department, I think you would need to change the legal ruling back to what it's long been, and also resume many of the US policies that distinguish between the West Bank and Israel in terms of where products are produced and things like that. And part of it is also, I think, taking a bit of a different approach with Israel and the international community, and kind of saying like, look, if you're going to take steps and policies that are against our specific policy, you break it, you own it. We are not going to spend a lot of time defending those policies in international organizations and institutions. You're going to have to deal with that, I think, which is, an important message to send. And, as part of that, also focusing in particular on some of the most sensitive and problematic settlements that are most threatening to the two-state solution. And that's not just settlements. An excellent recent report out just this week by Yehuda Shaul that I recommend to everyone on sort of the infrastructure that's being built inside the West Bank, things like that. It's about roads. It's about connecting the settlements to Israel. So there's a lot of things there that are sort of, threatening the viability of two states, that where the U.S. needs to take, sort of a tougher position. Things like also, maintaining the status quo to Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif. So those would be sort of the steps we would recommend early. Some of them are pretty tough. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Longer term, this is the second line of effort. Like, what are some of the other key structural things that need to change? In our opinion, one is just, again, going back to this theme of improving freedom, security, and prosperity for everyone. I think there's a lot of steps that can be taken to take parts of what are considered Area C, which is controlled by Israel in the West Bank. Israel controls 60% of the territory in the West Bank, and putting them under either Area B or Area A, which in other words, giving Palestinians more control over those areas so that you can have sort of more economic development and projects, so that you can have, with just moving a couple of percentage points, you can take 200,000 Palestinian homes that are under the threat of, or I think 200,000 Palestinian people roughly, who are under the threat of demolition, of having their homes demolished because they were built in Area C, off of that threat. There's a lot of space there, I think, to work just in general, like in terms of relaxing some of the restrictions that like really choke economic life in the Palestinian territories. And also, I think as part of it, relooking, and this is really important, legal outcomes in the occupied territories, where the reality is that, if you're Israeli, you are subject to one set of laws and rules when you're in that territory. And really, you are basically, you get due process. And if you're Palestinian, you're subject to military law with a conviction rate of almost 100%. 50 years into an occupation, we think it's important to relook that, especially since that changes things today. If you can make changes there, improves people's lives today and creates a better environment. And it also puts you in a better trajectory long-term towards getting to an agreement. We also, in the long run, I think, look very much at this question of Palestinian governance. The US needs to hold countries all over the Middle East to greater account on questions of transparency and democracy and responsiveness. And that includes the Palestinian Authority, which has had real challenges in that space and has not had an election in 13 years now. Part of the challenges the Palestinians also face is one of division. And I think here the US also needs to change its position. Our position is kind of evolved from opposing any unity between Gaza and the West Bank that includes some kind of a deal between Fatah and Hamas, we've moved to a position now where we're kind of agnostic about the whole thing, but I think it's actually something we should be willing to be open to and support. That doesn't mean the US has to engage with Hamas, but it does mean that you look at some kind of a unity deal. We proposed this in our Gaza report a couple of years ago, where you have a long-term ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, where Hamas at least sort of, renounces violence implicitly, if not explicitly. And then as part of that, you also have the PA start to take responsibility for pieces of governance of Gaza, and over time, even demilitarization. And as part of that, you also have, you're going to have to let Hamas somehow into the political entity inside the PLO, some kind of a three-way deal that works for Israel, Fatah and Hamas. And look, the US can't drive this. Ultimately, Palestinians have to drive this, but we should not stand in the way, and where we can be supportive, we can be supportive. Maybe I'll, in terms of the last, I guess, two other just key long-term things we've looked at. One is settlements. We have this proposal of, sort of the international, you break it, you own it approach towards Israel. That's one option. You can look at other alternatives long-term, whether that's a partial settlement freeze, or whether the US should even consider putting down its own map to sort of override the Trump map. This would have to come after, both of these proposals would have to be sort of, carefully consulted with Israelis and Palestinians first. And what it can't be is some of the proposals that are out there that kind of say, like, don't build beyond the barrier, or like Israel can build in Area C, or Palestinians can build in Area C if Israel can build in the settlements. Those don't work, in my opinion, because a lot of the most contested territories inside the barrier, and a trade-off of Area C which is supposed to be in a future Palestinian land for settlements, which is also kind of supposed to be future Palestinian land, is not really the trade-off you're looking for. But can you at least use some of these ideas on freezes, or even an American map-based policy, and try to deter the worst and preserve space for two states? Is I think what we're thinking about, or is that too complicated? And finally, I'll just say, in the long run, also looking at a US approach to engaging with the populations, and I think we have this big bill going through Congress right now that's going to include, a bunch of money for this ALMEP fund for direct engagement between the two societies. It also means engaging various constituencies who often haven't been engaged very much by the United States, whether that's religious communities on both sides or different minority groups, because the reality is this is a long play. This is not something that we're going to solve tomorrow. And so you have to be engaging with all these different groups, both to try to address their concerns so that they aren't spoilers, and hear them. And also because, again, we have no choice as part of this process. And it's something, frankly, I think that we haven't been always very good at. So anyway, I'll stop there and hand it over to Tammy to talk about sort of the US and international approach, and also some of the other options we thought about that we ended up not going with.
Thanks, Ilan. Really great to have all of you with us today. And I'm going to be brief and look forward to Shibley's comments on this report. I do want to emphasize that there are areas in which we made very clear recommendations. And there are areas, as Ilan just described, where we lay out a series of options and discuss the pros and cons, and then suggest that US policymakers can weigh these options and make decisions. But one of the things that's clear, as Michael said at the outset, is that even before the Trump administration took office and kind of threw the playing cards up in the air on this conflict, it's not as though US policy was achieving its objectives in this conflict. And so it's really important to examine not just the substance of American policy, but how the US government has organized itself to address this conflict. How has it worked with other actors in the international system in the region? And how could it do those things better? So briefly, our recommendations in that regard. On the US role internationally, look, traditionally, certainly since the Oslo Declaration, the United States has sought to sort of monopolize the international agenda on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It certainly has brought in other actors within frameworks like the Quartet. But in many ways, those frameworks were designed to keep everybody kind of marching in lockstep with the United States and not going off in different directions or operating at different paces. What we're suggesting is a more flexible approach that recognizes the fact that within the region, relationships have changed, and international actors have different relationships with the two parties and with others in the region today, that gives them, in certain places and on certain issues, more leverage or different kinds of leverage over the issues than the United States has. And so to take maximum advantage of that, the US needs a more flexible, multifaceted approach. So just to take one example, and one that Ilan and colleagues described in great detail in a Gaza report last year. But if you're trying to address the situation in Gaza, this horrific humanitarian crisis and the political division, and the rule of Hamas, you know, the United States can do some work there, but Egypt obviously has a huge role to play. And the United Nations Special Coordinator, which is about to turn over, has also been a really important player in dealing with Gaza over the last years. And so in that particular instance, those are the parties that the United States should be working closely with and building an approach with together. On other issues, it might be different coalitions. Secondly, the US needs to adjust its approach in the region and how it's interacting with regional players. And we spotlight in our report, particularly Jordan, as a country that is, as we've seen this year, quite vulnerable to negative developments in this conflict, but also a country that has been one of the most consistent and constructive supporters of Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution, and a key player at many times in crisis management between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Now, under the Trump administration, the US-Jordanian relationship was by and large neglected. The Jordanian role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was largely neglected. And over the course of the last year in particular, as the Israeli government toyed with the idea of annexing territory in the West Bank, we saw the Israeli-Jordanian relationship really reach one of its lowest points since the signing of the Israeli-Jordanian peace treaty. So one of our primary recommendations is that the US invest more in working with Jordan on the conflict. There is also a lot to do to build on the agreements between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment, but I do want to highlight it as something that we definitely think there is something to build on, although we also don't think its impact should be overstated. And then, of course, you know, if the US is going to change its approach, it has to change the architecture of how it works this issue inside the US government. And, you know, in an era when the US thought that it was close to a final status agreement, when there were high-level, high-stakes negotiations going on between the parties, it made sense for policy on this issue within the US government to be restricted to a very tight circle and held at extremely senior levels in the White House and sometimes also in the State Department. But that's not where we are now, as Michael and Ilan have laid out. And so the United States needs an architecture that will enable strong interagency consensus, that will leverage all of the tools in the American policy toolbox, and that will enable a more sustainable approach on all these issues that are going to take some time to work, moving this conflict back toward resolution. So we are suggesting, number one, that there is not a high-level presidential envoy, and number two, that the issue be managed as part of the regular interagency process, with a strong role for the State Department and the Near East Bureau in the State Department. Obviously, it's an issue that, because of the relationships involved, will require senior attention, senior support, but that's not the same thing as the day-to-day agenda item for the President of the United States or even the Secretary of State. So before we close this sort of quick summary, I want to just address maybe three elephants in the room, if you will, three big issues that were debated hotly over the course of our task force meetings, and that are often subjects of heated debate when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And just address explicitly how we choose to look at each of these issues. So one argument that is often put forward in an America that is increasingly tired of the messy Middle East is, well, look, Israelis and Palestinians don't want to make peace. Let them stew in their own juices. The United States should simply, manage this conflict, try to prevent a conflagration, but otherwise just back off. Don't try. It's pointless. We disagree. The status quo, as we see it, is not stable. It is degrading. And that will have implications not only for the security and livelihoods of Israelis and Palestinians who live daily with the harm of this conflict, but also for the security interests of Israel and Palestine's neighbors and the United States. So we don't think it can simply be left to conflict management. Aaron Miller often says this conflict is like a shark. If it's not, if you're not actively moving it forward, it can't breathe, right? So there's a lot that we think, despite the difficulty of what we see as the obstacles in this report, we see a lot of room where the United States can work with the parties to improve freedom, security, and prosperity for Israelis and Palestinians. And we don't think that the search for a final status agreement should delay or deter that work. The second kind of alternative hypothesis is what's often called outside in. And it was given a big boost with the breakthrough in diplomatic relations between Israel and the Gulf states. It's the idea that the Palestinians are not interested in engaging either with the United States or with Israel, but other Arab states are. So that should upend American assumptions about how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And instead of working with the two parties, the United States should work outside in, using relations between Israel and Arab states in the region as a way of trying to change the calculations of the two parties on the ground. Let's be clear, this new Arab state engagement with Israel is a positive. It's a positive for the region. It's a positive for Israeli security. It's a positive for American interests. It suggests that our various partners in the region are more willing to work together on behalf of common regional goals, and that's a good thing. The US should welcome and encourage that. But I do think there are reasons to be skeptical that these new normalization agreements can generate breakthroughs on the Israeli-Palestinian front. One of the major hypotheses behind this view has been that somehow these Gulf states can change the calculations of the Palestinian leadership, can influence Palestinian opinion. But I think what we've seen is actually the opposite. The Palestinian leadership and Palestinian public opinion are very opposed to these normalization agreements. They feel betrayed. They don't feel that these governments have their interests at heart. And so these governments are simply not well positioned to have that kind of impact on Palestinian thinking. Now, it may be that over time, these agreements will have impact on the Israeli public and Israeli thinking. We've seen this incredible warm welcome on both sides between Israel and the UAE. And it could be that that will change Israeli perceptions and awake a sense of hopefulness about the future that Israelis haven't felt in a while. But that's the kind of thing that will take time to play out. So I think the US needs to be awake to those possibilities, but it doesn't need a thorough revision of its approach. Finally and quickly, the two-state solution. This is something we debated extensively because there are a lot of voices that believe a two-state solution is no longer viable and it should no longer be the objective for American policy. It's our view that none of the alternative outcomes that are presented as alternative peaceful outcomes are any more viable, any more durable, or frankly, any more likely to be peaceful than the two-state outcome. And the two-state outcome is the one that still has the greatest degree of support among Israelis, Palestinians, the region, and the rest of the world. So it's our view the United States should continue to pursue it, but recognizing that its viability is an increasing question, it's only prudent for the US to pursue a policy planning process or a strategic planning process that evaluates what the alternatives look like and what might happen in the region and for the United States if two states don't come about. So with that, I will stop and look forward to Shibley's comments.
So Shibley, let me invite you to chime in here and, both, you're not an author in the report. Let us know what you think we missed, what we think was wrong, and also what you like about it, I hope.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me to provide some comments on this. First of all, I want to say congratulations to Tamara, Ilan, and Michael, and also to Hadi, who I know is not part of the final report, but who contributed a lot to it. This is a strong and important report that's really deserving of the conversation, national conversation, as the new administration is taking office. So I know that any report is going to be, criticized no matter what you do, and I will have some points of criticism. But I invite anybody to try to put a report out right now in this environment, one that is likely to engage our politics in this shifting environment, and one that takes into account the strategic environment that is changing in the region. It's really hard to do, and one that takes also into account the conversation as it now exists, particularly with the widening gap between democratic public opinion on the one hand, which is far more progressive on this issue and forward-leaning, and where the establishment Democrats are, particularly in Congress, on this issue, and try to find a voice in that environment is hard. So this is in many ways a success. It's a really important report, and I hope everyone will read it, and it'll become part of our national conversation as we move forward. Let me just say some of the things that I really like about the report. First, I like the focus on freedom, prosperity, and security for all, regardless of what the outcome is, regardless of what we do in the negotiations. This needs to be fleshed out even more than it is in the report, for sure, but that is a principle that is extremely important in order to not be distracted by the process and pay attention to the inequity on the ground, the unacceptable environment, 53 years of continuing occupation with no end in sight. It's really important to keep that in mind as a starting point for any conversation about the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians. And I urge everyone to have that as a slogan almost up front before even considering possibilities. The second, I also like the idea or the thought of trying to construct an American-Palestinian relationship that's not merely a corollary of the US-Israeli relationship. That has been, of course, a problem really since the Oslo agreements. And now, obviously, it's even more important to do so. And there are quite a few recommendations that are helpful, although many of them return us to the pre-Trump era. But I think the principle of it is extremely important, including a reopening consulate in Jerusalem, reopening of the PLO office in Washington, and all of that. And the third is, I think, the focus on improving the situation on the ground, regardless of the political process in the short term, particularly humanitarian. I think we all are aware of what happened over the past 4 years of the Trump era, where there's so much suffering, more suffering than before, not just institutionally, but more importantly, among people in Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza, but also diaspora Palestinians who have been serviced by UNRWA historically. So the recommendations in that regard is extremely helpful and important, and I hope the new administration will take them into account. I also like the focus on working, tailoring relationship with international partners to address key problem rather than be merely American focused. And I think The one that Tamara gave about Gaza is an example. That's certainly important, and I keep in mind that Daniel Kurtzer and Aaron David Miller had this article about multilateralism and various ways of thinking about multilateralism. Obviously, that's something that should be on the table for any American foreign policy. So I want to raise some questions, I think, for the conversations that are important to keep in mind. The first one that the report clearly anticipated and thought about a lot, and Tamara mentioned that as well, about the two-state solution. I think the argument, of course, is strong, which is that, look, there is nothing that, this is still the one that more Palestinians and Israelis support. This is where the international community is. That's where the American mainstream is. It's really hard to put something on the table that is likely to engage that and stay within the realm of diplomatic possibility. Fine, I think that's a reasonable way to start, particularly putting a recommendation. The problem, of course, is that if I were to poll, people in experts, regional experts on the Middle East, about what is the likelihood of a two-state solution at this point, I think you'd have a majority say it's unlikely. A majority say it's unlikely. So in essence, maybe they're wrong, of course, and we don't know, and theoretically still possible. But if that's the case, of course, there's a cost associated with it, right? Which is the cost that we've seen in the past, which is that we pretend that this is a temporary situation, that the inequity on the Palestinian-Israeli front is just a function of the temporary transitional period until we get to a two-state solution when everything will be fine. And in the meanwhile, of course, we have, it's become harder to achieve a two-state solution. And let's be realistic. When Obama came to office, the possibility of two-state was much higher than it is now. In the last 12 years, undoubtedly, it's been, become more remote. And when you add to that, that Obama was probably individually more interested in pushing it than perhaps President-elect Biden is, you can understand why people will be, sort of skeptical about pushing that. So the real question is, if you're going to push for that, then how do you make sure that it doesn't undermine, does not distract you from the inequity on the ground that has to be addressed one way or the other? Now, the report does that up to a point. That is that, obviously it's a thoughtful report that has taken this into account. But I think that it needs to be fleshed out more with regard to the sort of things that cannot be allowed under any circumstances. One of the things that the report anticipates here is saying, okay, if we reach a conclusion it's not possible now or later, we need to make clear that whatever outcome that is going to take place will be one that's equitable, with equal rights and freedom and security for all. That's important. But again, that needs to be fleshed out, because I think that is the one that people are going to have to be grappling with, day in and day out. And finally, with regard to this issue of two states, I think the question, of course, it's easy to say negotiable settlement or going back to the negotiations. And frankly, there's an asymmetry of power, and negotiations are not likely to result in an equitable outcome. And that asymmetry of power has grown over the past 4 years. So unless there's some kind of leverage from the outside, it's really impossible to imagine that that's going to lead anywhere. And so the question is then, what about American leverage? The authors talk about a toolbox, but the toolbox, of course, if you start with a position that the president-elect has taken, which is that aid is off the table, then it becomes a little bit hard to see where the leverage is going to come from. I think, for example, with regard to the annexation issue, you saw how even mainstream Democrats, I'm not talking about progressives, reached the conclusion that you have to at least consider tying aid to possible annexation. So that issue has been already, put on the table by mainstream Democrats in Congress. I think it's important to add that to the conversation about where the American leverage is going to come from to push this forward. A couple of other points that I want to make that are just on issues. One is on settlements. Obviously, this is one where there is a consensus in the American mainstream. There has been a consensus in the American mainstream, but has shifted since the Trump administration. But there's definitely a consensus among Democrats on opposition to settlements that remains very, very strong. And here, I think the report is very careful in articulating possibilities and still sticks with the principle of opposition to settlements, but contemplates other possibilities, more limited possibilities, particularly whether there should be differentiation between settlements. I personally think that's a slippery slope. Once you start thinking that way, of sort of thinking some settlements are okay, some settlements are not, let's consider it. It's a slippery slope where you lose the principle altogether. It's better to live with things perhaps sometimes, as politicians have to do, but as a matter of principle, never deviate from that issue, because that is a cornerstone of the idea that you're recommending of a two-state based on 242. I do like the fact that among the things that you recommend up front is return to reference to international law, UN resolutions. That's really important. It's not so much that it's going to frame what is going to happen exactly, but especially given what the Trump administration did of ignoring international law and norms and so forth, that becomes essential. The question of payments to prisoners, which you had to address, frankly, because of course it is part of the law, that is going to be an obstacle to building a constructive relationship between the Palestinians and the US. It has to be addressed. But nonetheless, I think you need to provide context. For example, I have tried to do that, obviously, in an article I wrote last week for Brookings, to provide this context of why this issue is hugely popular among the Palestinians, universal support for it, actually, that is going to make it hard for a PA to address. And one way to do that is to point out that at the same time, there's also this Israeli collective punishment of families of perpetrators of violence, including house demolition, something that is, of course, not parallel to when a settler commits a crime against Palestinians. Their families don't suffer the loss of house demolition, and they shouldn't, frankly, because the principle is wrong. Whether it's applied to Israelis or to Palestinians, it's collective punishment. It is against the Geneva Convention. It is something in principle that we don't accept. And why not also raise that question, particularly tied to the question of restructuring the provision of payments, because I think people have to think about them together, and that's a principle. That principal position leads me to the final point. I think we all have started with what are the interests of the United States here? That's obviously central. Everybody's going to start with strategic interests of the United States, and those are important. We have to think about them, and they have to be primary. But look, we are now in the middle of a values war in America. This is what this election has been about. This is the sort of, we're all struggling about what is an American, what does America stand for? And obviously the winning coalition right now in America, not just among Democrats, but that's what won the presidency, is one of a principle of equality, of human rights, of international law, of multilateralism. That's the package, that's a winning package that we ought to advocate. And I don't see that, I see the spirit of that reflected in an attempt to be very fair in the analysis, but I think it needs to be projected as a goal. And that frames what we do beyond what we think of as traditional strategic interests, and say, well, this is not an important priority for the United States right now. It isn't, of course, and it's not going to be a top priority for Biden, but for God's sake, we have a moral obligation, not only because, we have a moral obligation anytime when there is something that is unjust, but we have a moral obligation because we are at this point of asymmetry that is hard to overcome, particularly because of our policies of support and unlimited support over the past many decades to get here. And we are going to continue because America's obligation to Israel that has been there and is likely to continue in the years to come means the US cannot extricate itself from the moral obligation to do it right on this issue. And that needs to be front and center.
So I think what we're going to do now is open it. Thank you, Shibley. That was, I think, a very fair, both critique and engagement. So I really appreciate that, and kind words also about the report. And so we've all, I think, spoken a little longer than we wanted to because we all have, I think, a lot to say on this issue. That's not uncommon. So what I'm going to do is there is a Q&A box. Please put your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to do kind of a couple of lightning rounds on this. So I'm going to go through once and sort of read a few of these questions or summarize them for folks. And then if more come in, maybe you'll do this again. So we've had a number of questions about the Palestinian role, and the leverage that they have and how they feel in the aftermath of some of these normalization agreements and what it means for Palestinians in the region. I think we had a more specific question about sort of what's the distinction between long-term and short-term in terms of our sort of recommendations, and when do different pieces kick in. One, I think a question about Gaza and sort of as part of rebuilding the US-Palestinian relationship, demanding a more constructive role from the PA in Gaza. I think, and then, an interesting question kind of arguing that, look, everybody thought things were going to go horribly if Trump, recognize a capital in Jerusalem, and they didn't go that bad. Maybe Biden can do the same thing on the other side and recognize a Palestinian state. How do folks feel about that idea? Spoiler alert, I wrote an op-ed on these issues in the Washington Post a few months ago, so I might weigh in on that particular question. Do you recommend keeping any part of the deal of the century or sort of getting rid of all of it? And then just another question that's come in, sort of what are thoughts about federation, confederation formulas, especially in the context that settlements are so built up, is it even possible to still physically separate? So there's a lot on the table there, which means everybody has an option of what they want to choose. You got so maybe we'll start with, why don't we start with Tammy on this one, actually. We'll throw it your way first, and then Michael and Shibley, and I'll clean up anything.
Okay, so maybe I'll take that last one on alternatives, federation, confederation, and I'll just say a word about the question on Jerusalem and whether the United States could do something similar on the other side, because I think that's an area where it's an interesting conversation to have, U.S. recognition of a Palestinian state. So on alternatives, we spent a bunch of time in the task force researching alternatives, looking at what would be required to bring them about. There have been a lot of creative proposals, including, this idea of having sort of one state with two governments where your governmental representation is decided by your ethnicity, not by where you live. Confederation, territory, federalism of various kinds. Look, the bottom line is that all those forms of coexistence that involve not merely the coexistence of two sovereign states side by side, but intermingled governmental relationships, they all demand an even higher degree of trust and the ability to cooperate on really crucial day-to-day issues than the two-state solution requires. None of that is present right now, which is why we don't have active constructive negotiations. And it's not simply that it's not present between the leaders, it's also not present in public opinion and public attitudes. There is not, one of the worst things that's happened over the last couple of decades is that Israelis and Palestinians have lost their faith that the other side is willing to peacefully coexist. And that's just a fundamental prerequisite for any negotiated solution, but the bar is even higher for federation and confederation. So let me just say a word about the Jerusalem recognition. Yeah, there was a lot of commentary, both in advance and after Trump's recognition of Jerusalem, that this would produce some kind of massive violent reaction on the Palestinian side, and that's why it was a disaster. I don't think that was ever really the concern, frankly. And I think it's sort of patronizing to make that a focus of the analysis. Oh, Palestinians will get violent if you do this. To me, the issue was and remains that when the United States takes steps like that, that set aside, devalue, denigrate, ignore, undermine the core narrative, the core aspirations of one party to this conflict, they rip away hope from that party that their needs can be addressed through negotiations sponsored by the United States. So, and when you do that, that has a ripple effect in the politics on the ground. And most of all, it has a profound impact on your ability as the United States to play a constructive role in brokering any kind of peace. So to me, that was the damage that was done with the Jerusalem Declaration, that it was unbalanced, that it gave no credence to Palestinian aspirations for a capital in Jerusalem. And it barely, as an afterthought when challenged, acknowledged that Jerusalem was agreed to by the parties as something they needed to negotiate.
Yeah, I'll quickly weigh in on the question of short-term and long-term and how it relates to the current situation for the Palestinians. So, at the moment, there are many things that that have to be fixed. You know, we've noted the humanitarian crisis in the West Bank and Gaza. That requires fixing, and it requires restoring funding to UNRWA, which under U.S. legislation at the moment, because of Taylor Force, is the only entity that can really provide that aid right now. You know, today there's a bill in front of the Knesset to legalize what used to be called illegal outposts, and I say illegal meaning illegal under Israeli law, and now are being called young settlements. There's a bill today in front of the Knesset to legalize those. These types of things are things that have to be dealt with in the short term. And once the situation is stabilized, I think that goes to the question of the Palestinians, because the last 4 years have really put the Palestinians feeling as if they're under siege. And if we're ever going to get to a point where there is a viable negotiated two-state outcome, the Palestinians are going to have to feel as if they have some sort of hope. And the fact is that the last 4 years, where there was effectively a maximum pressure campaign on the Palestinians, whether you support that policy or not, it certainly hasn't been successful in getting the Palestinians to engage with Israel, engage with the United States, or come closer to sitting down for negotiations. So I think that taking care of these short-term steps will have benefit not only in the short term, but in the long run, in terms of making a deal between the two sides, which is incredibly far off, making it more feasible. And once you do that, then you can start to get to some of the more medium and long-term things that are designed to have a more lasting impact, as opposed to things that really need to be done to kind of staunch the bleeding at the moment.
Shibley, you want to weigh in on anything?
Just briefly, I mean, I think, you know, I even will tie in Barack Ravid's question. He had two questions, one related to what would happen if the government of Israel rejects the proposal to open a consulate in Jerusalem, and in any way, how will the Obama administration respond to a question about what its policy on Israel-Palestine is, just sort of to bring us to reality. And I think that is a very important question in the following sense, that if we're starting by saying this is not a priority issue for the Biden administration, and therefore, and yet there are proposals here that are not especially bold, but bold in the context of where the environment is and the priorities are, thinking about them strategically, will the Biden administration go to bat or use any leverage or expend any energy trying to implement even such a seemingly straightforward proposition as reopening a consulate in Jerusalem? I'm not really sure. I have to say, I'm not really sure.
So maybe I'll close with answering a couple of questions and also some of the ones that have been sprinkled in since we went through the first list. There's a few things I wanted to engage on. One was a question about Gaza and should we be pushing the Palestinian Authority further on Gaza? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think the Palestinian Authority is certainly going to welcome a shift away from sort of the Trump's approach to the world. But it's a two-way street. I mean, there will be an expectation, I hope, and I would recommend that a next administration make clear to the Palestinian leadership that it has its own expectations. And part of that is this prisoner issue. And part of that, and the most important part, I think, is long-term governance and unity. But Gaza and a constructive role, especially in humanitarian assistance in Gaza on electricity and water, I think needs to be critical. And it needs to be critical that the US is communicating that to everybody, that Gaza is always an afterthought, but not in this case. A couple of other things that have come up. The issue of the state of Palestine, I think, was already answered partially by Tammy, but I'll just reiterate at least that, look, in a Washington Post op-ed a few months ago, I said, in the context of Israeli annexation, if you're looking for some hope as a two-state solution is dying, I'd recommend, a U.S. recognition of Palestine in response to that. Not in the context of Israeli annexation. I think what's most important is to see progress on Palestinian governance. Again, these issues of if Palestinian leadership and polity is demonstrating through its actions that it's ready for statehood, then I think the U.S. should very seriously consider it. If it's not, then the U.S. shouldn't do it. This question on the consul general in Jerusalem, I will say this: there are a number of other countries. I actually have on my list, France, Italy, Belgium, Spain, Greece, Sweden, Turkey, United Kingdom, the Holy See, that have their embassies in, Jerusalem. They have their consulates to the Palestinians in Jerusalem or East Jerusalem. And if Israel is willing to do that for those countries, why shouldn't it be willing to do it for the United States, its closest strategic partner and ally? The reality is, I don't think this is that big of a political issue in Israel, as not nearly as big as some of the other things that are out there, just reopening this consulate. And I do think there will be other challenges that will be faced in the U.S.-Israel relationship early on that have a lot to do with where it seems like, the Biden administration is going on Iran, and where, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be going on Iran. I still think there's hope to work those things out or not have become a major issue. But given all of that, it would seem to me kind of, foolish to make this a big issue and to be problematic. You will need Israeli cooperation in reopening the consulate in Jerusalem, but I think it'd be really unfortunate if this became an issue that Israel rejected. I don't think it would be a very good early signal to send to a new American administration. It's not a massive political issue in Israel, so let's not make it one in the U.S.-Israel relationship. And then maybe just to close on this issue, there've been a lot of questions about normalization. I think I might be a little more optimistic on normalization and where it might go than some others. I do think you already see, in many cases, the Arab states haven't had to deal with the details of this conflict. They've been kind of removed from it. But now that they are on the ground, they're stumbling into all kinds of interesting problems that they didn't even realize existed or that they knew. And that right now, I think they're still just in the early learning process of that for the UAE and Bahrain. But I actually think it can become a positive if they can wrap their heads around some of these challenges and become more constructive players. In some ways, the two most constructive Arab players are Egypt and Jordan, because they have to live with it every day, because they are on the borders, because their interests are engaged. And the more, tightly held and the more strongly the Arab-Israeli, sort of Gulf Israel relationship becomes, the more these interests will also matter in some ways to the Gulf states. So I think and the more actually the influence they might have. So, that's not necessarily where we are right now. Again, I completely agree this can't be the centerpiece of our policy, but that's one way to sort of think about the trajectory of this going forward. So with that, I think I will close us down 10 minutes late. Sorry. Thanks for the folks who decided to stay a little longer. very much appreciate, thank you especially to, Tamara and to Michael and also, our partners on this. Thank you, Shibley, for excellent analysis and for joining us. Thank you to, all of our colleagues who were part of some of the meetings we had over the last year, and especially to Hattie, who was such a great partner in all of this. And so with that, thank you very much. Look forward to hearing your feedback.